Canada before World War II was a country still searching for its national identity. It was a British dominion with close ties to the United States through extensive trade and cultural exchange. But Canada's population was overwhelmingly ethnically British, with limited experience in fighting wars outside of a colonial context. Canada's entry into the Second World War would change all of this. This is part 4 of our series on D-Day. Officially, Canada declared war on December 8, 1941, the same day the US and Great Britain declared. However, Mackenzie King, the leader of Canada and the Canadian cabinet, said the war was on the 7th, so Canada acted first. 4 hours after Pearl Harbor, an equivalent time, Japan attacked Hong Kong. Canada had its reasons to declare war, writes John Ferguson. The Hong Kong garrison of 14,000 included 2,000 Canadians. The colony surrendered on Christmas Day after a horrible bloody battle that included hand-to-hand fighting. There were 10,000 casualties, including 6,000 Japanese. But if the attack on Pearl Harbor caught Canada off guard, why did they declare war? What were the reasons that Canada entered the Second World War? In this video, we're going to be looking at Canada's path to war, and particularly focusing on how events in Asia brought Canada into the conflict. Let's get started. When war broke out in 1939, Canada felt compelled to support Britain. As a British dominion, Canada had obligations to the Crown, but it also had extensive economic and cultural ties to the United States. Remember, Canada's population was predominantly British, and most Canadians looked to Britain as their cultural and historic home. Plus, the United States had not yet entered the conflict. Prime Minister Mackenzie King decided to wait and see how things played out. In May of 1940, however, when France fell and Great Britain found itself under threat of invasion, Canada began to prepare for war. The Canadian government passed the War Measures Act, which gave the government broad powers to mobilize the economy and conscript men into the military. The act has only been invoked twice since then, once for each of Canada's official world wars, while never being technically mobilized for the European War. Thousands of Canadians volunteered to fight in Britain, and about 30,000 crossed the Atlantic to join the fight. By late 1940, tensions were rising in the Pacific as Japan expanded its influence into Chinese territory. The Japanese advance threatened British possessions, and Canada's role in the British Commonwealth meant that Canada, too, was now at risk. Of course, Pearl Harbor would change everything. On December 8, 1941, Canada's Parliament met an emergency session to discuss the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. In his speech to the House, Prime Minister Mackenzie King stated, "The Government of Canada, in the fullest confidence of the support of the people of Canada, has decided that, in view of the aggressive policies of the Government of Japan, it must at once take active measures to safeguard the security of Canada and the Dominion's interests in the Pacific." After debate, Parliament passed a motion declaring that Canada was indeed at war with Japan. Technically, this should have happened the previous day as per British time. So why did Canada feel compelled to go to war in the Pacific? Why not focus on winning the war in Europe? We can identify 3 primary reasons. First, there were strategic considerations, including the defense of British colonies. Second, there were economic factors. And third, there was the issue of national identity. Let's start with the British colonies. When Japan entered the war, it represented a new danger for the British Empire. Previously, most of the Japanese-British confrontation had occurred in China, which was seen as a less critical part of the world, given the lack of European involvement. However, Japan's swift advance in the Pacific and its alliance with Germany and Italy made it clear that the conflict had indeed become global. If Japan managed to capture British colonies in the region, then Britain's naval and military position would be even more precarious than it already was. Given its obligations to defend the colonies, this placed Canada in a precarious situation. With troops scattered across the UK, Canada couldn't intervene directly in the Pacific. But by declaring war, Canada could contribute much-needed resources to the British effort, such as men and supplies. Economically, the war was already extremely costly for both Britain and Canada. Before the war, Canada was tied to the British Empire through a complex network of economic agreements and treaties. These agreements provided Canada with important economic benefits, especially in terms of trade and investment. For example, Canada exported a great deal of its resources to Britain, including wheat, minerals, and manufactured goods. By 1940, Canada was Britain's fourth largest supplier of raw materials. Additionally, Canada was dependent on Britain for many of its imports, such as manufactured goods and industrial supplies. In fact, before the war, 60% of Canada's international trade was with the British Empire. The war was putting a serious strain on the Canadian economy, but joining the conflict would ensure that Canada's economic interests continued to be protected. But there was another reason why Canada went to war: the question of national identity. Since the beginning of the war, Canadians had debated whether or not they should participate in the conflict. Some felt that as a dominion within the British Empire, Canada had obligations to support Britain, while others argued that Canada should remain neutral and focus on protecting its own interests. Those who supported neutrality believed that Canada's interests were best served by staying out of a European war that had nothing to do with Canada. They feared that if Canada became involved in the conflict, it would be dragged into a costly and unnecessary war that would result in significant loss of life and economic hardship. On the other hand, those who supported joining the war effort felt that Canada had a moral obligation to support Britain, its mother country, and the wider British Commonwealth. They argued that Canada's identity was deeply rooted in its ties to Britain, and that remaining neutral would be seen as a betrayal of that heritage. The decision to declare war was ultimately a way of affirming Canada's national identity and its place in the world. By joining the war effort, Canadians were able to demonstrate their loyalty to the British Commonwealth and their commitment to the values and principles that they shared with their fellow citizens. After declaring war, Canada began to mobilize its resources for the fight. The Canadian government quickly began to conscript men into the military and began to build up its armed forces. Thousands of Canadians volunteered to fight, and the country began to produce weapons, ammunition, and other supplies for the war effort. The Canadian contribution to the war effort would be significant. By the end of the war, over 80,000 Canadians had served overseas and more than 45,000 had lost their lives. Canada's contribution was vital to the Allied victory in the war. However, Canada's involvement in the war was not without its challenges. The country faced a number of economic and social difficulties as a result of the conflict, including the conscription of men into the military, the rationing of food and other supplies, and the internment of Japanese Canadians. Despite these challenges, the Canadian people rallied together and made sacrifices to support the war effort. The end of the war would bring with it a new era for Canada. The country had emerged from the conflict as a major player on the world stage and would go on to play an important role in the post-war order. What are your thoughts? Why do you think Canada felt compelled to enter the war in Asia? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Also, be sure to check out our recent video on D-Day and the Allied invasion of Normandy. Thanks for watching.